afternoon. I'm Brian Taylor, and it's my honor to welcome you to the Harvey S. Perloff Lecture Series on Race and Transportation, co-hosted by the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies and the Department of Urban Planning. Let me now turn to the featured speaker for today's event, Jesus Barajas. He's an assistant professor of environmental science and policy and affiliated faculty with the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. His research sits at the intersection of transportation planning and environmental justice. His work addresses how systems of inequities influence travel behavior and how policymakers can and should respond to them. He has led projects on topics ranging from travel behavior to transport safety to the implications of policing on transport planning. So it's now my honor to turn things over to Jesus, who's going to speak to us on Safe for Whom, Transportation Safety in the Context of Planning and Infrastructure Inequities. Jesus?
All right, thank you, Brian, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be with you virtually today from my home. And let me just get my screen share up. So I'm thankful to ITS at UCLA for inviting me and to the Perloff Lecture Series. I think this is, I had the chance to attend the session last week on mobility justice, and the speakers coming up look fantastic. And I think it's great that I'm sandwiched between Adonia Lugo, who spoke last week on mobility justice, and Sarah Seo, who's coming up next week, who's going to speak on traffic enforcement, because I think my work kind of is a good bridge between those two themes. As I link together mobility justice and traffic enforcement with connections and implications for planning. So what I want to do today in my talk on Safe for Whom is talk about the context of transportation safety for vulnerable road users, and how the paradigm is slowly changing. The conversation around safety is slowly changing. And then where I see the links between mobility justice and both the problems and solutions to safety. I'll get into a little bit of background on safety and enforcement and talk about a couple of studies that I've done that have examined these issues. And I'm going to focus there on the connections between safety, cycling, and traffic enforcement, and then end with some conclusions as I see the role of planning as it relates to these issues. And I think it's fair to say that we are in an epidemic, a safety epidemic when it comes to transportation safety, on top of the epidemic that we're living through in our daily lives. And just kind of pointing to the statistics, these numbers come from the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, that show the rise in the number of pedestrian and fatalities, a dramatic rise over the last decade. And what I'm not showing here is that vehicle deaths have declined or stayed flat over the same period of time. So the low point in terms of the number of pedestrian deaths actually comes before the 2010 date I have on this chart, where there were 4,100 pedestrian fatalities. And as you see the numbers climb, it's an increase of 51% over the decade. And cycling, the numbers aren't as great because there aren't as many cyclists, but we still see a 36% increase in the number of cyclist fatalities on the roadways in the United States. The book Right of Way that came out this last year, I think, has a really good sort of chapter by chapter breakdown of some of the reasons for this decline in pedestrian safety. Some of it has to do with just the sheer size of vehicles. Most vehicles now are SUVs and trucks, whereas just 20 years ago they were, four-door sedans. The rise of driver distractions, texting and driving, and these infotainment systems where we keep drawing eyes away from the streets. And then roadway design is a culprit, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Just to kind of highlight here, I showed you the statistics on cycling and pedestrian fatalities. But if we look at the change in overall travel, vehicle miles traveled has increased by 8%. The share of walking, the share that walking makes of all trips has increased by less than 1%. Cycling is a similar small number, even though those deaths have declined. So, these deaths far exceed the increase in vehicle miles travel, an increase in that share of all trips. And this image comes from the Dangerous by Design report that Smart Growth America puts out every couple of years. The 2021 report is due out very shortly, at the end of the month. They said on a release on their blog earlier in February, and the release is worth examining, as it kind of shows the exasperation of the organization in terms of they keep putting out statistics on deaths, and nothing seems to be changing. So in light of this safety epidemic, I think there's a changing paradigm in the way that safety professionals are thinking about transportation and traffic safety. It's traditionally been viewed as a problem of driver error. So drivers are going to do what they're going to do. So let's make sure to make the road system forgiving of those mistakes. And the way that the road system has been designed to be forgiving has been kind of taking the standards from interstate highways and applying them kind of everywhere. Wide lanes, clear zones that promote or at least don't inhibit low speeds and may promote high speeds. And then in a combination with education and traffic enforcement to kind of help shift driver behavior away from these dangerous activities. So if we look at sort of educational campaigns, seatbelt campaigns, DUI campaigns, both enforcement and education, have been effective in eliminating deaths due to these causes over the years. But there seems to be a tapering off because we're not seeing that same effect for things like distracted driving. And we've had distracted driving campaigns now for quite some time. So the shift in thinking has been from this, let's focus on the driver and accommodate the errors, to let's think about the system as a whole. Let's use a safe systems approach to traffic safety. So it recognizes still that people will make mistakes, but the solution is instead to design the system to account for human vulnerability. So humans are fragile. We will perish at greater numbers when vehicle speeds are higher. And so the thinking is, well, let's design the system to promote safer roads in addition to the safe vehicles that we've already had or that have been proliferating. And so designers then take some responsibility for how those safe systems look. Those other elements, education and enforcement, are still part of this safe systems approach, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think a key difference from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things is targeting interventions through the use of data, which highlights where the most dangerous locations are and where interventions need to be targeted. In the United States, this safe systems approach has generally been implemented at Vision Zero, imported from Sweden, and who started their campaign in the late 90s, which has a goal of achieving zero fatalities on the road system. And since it's been brought to the US in the early to middle of the last decade, about 40 cities, more than 40 cities, have stated Vision Zero policies. And so what this targeted data, what this data analysis and targeted intervention has shown us is that communities of color bear the brunt of this safety burden. So I'm showing 3 maps from 3 different Vision Zero cities across the US. The left is, of course, Los Angeles. And the blue shaded areas indicate locations in the city that have high scores on the health equity index, which indicates greater degrees of disadvantage across multiple indicators. About half of the high injury network streets, or the streets where most of the crashes and deaths occur, are in these high index communities with poor health outcomes and economic conditions. The middle map shows San Francisco, and here the shaded areas show the communities of concern, which the MPO defines in terms of socioeconomic characteristics and other characteristics of vulnerability. So in San Francisco, about 3/4 of the severe and fatal injuries occur on just 13% of their streets. 31% of all streets are in communities of concern, but half of the high injury network is in those same communities. And the image on the right shows Chicago. And I don't have the same demographic overlay there, but on that map, you can see the high crash corridors and the high crash areas are mostly on the west and south sides of the city, which are the predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods in the city. If we zoom out, I'm coming back to national level statistics. What I've done in these couple of charts is overlaid the share of fatalities by racial and ethnic category, along with shares in the populations and shares trip-taking characteristics. And so we see here too that Black, Indigenous people of color are overrepresented in these fatality statistics. So I'm aggregating 4 years of fatality data, 5 years of fatality data here, 2014 to 2018. I'm looking at the American Community Survey over the same period of time and the National Household Travel Survey. If we look at the pedestrian deaths in the middle, Black pedestrians made up 19% of pedestrian fatalities, but only 12% of the population, 11% of miles walked, and 13% of trips taken. Similar story among cyclists, 14% of bicycle fatalities, but only 4% of miles cycled and 6% of trips taken. So where you see that the leftmost bar in the cluster higher than the rest of the bars in the cluster, that's showing a difference and likely evidence of disparities, because other research has pointed to deficiencies in infrastructure in Black and brown neighborhoods, like fewer bike lanes, poor sidewalk quality, more high-speed roads that lead to these characteristics that we see here. Patterns are not much different in California. Again, these arrows are kind of highlighting where the disparities are. And you can see for Black drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists across the board, more deaths than their share in the population and the amount traveled. So I think what this, this evolution in safety is showing is where the how identity is implicated in in the behavior that people take, the patterns that we're seeing in terms of outcomes. And the mobility justice framework, I think, helps kind of pull these issues together and gives us insights into safety problems and solutions that we may not have thought of otherwise. And what I like about mobility justice framework, that I'm not going to go into great detail about because we've already talked about this in this lecture series, but there's the blend of the academic thinking that draws on mobility studies, that draws on theories of justice, from environmental justice to political philosophy, together with grassroots thinking about sort of how people experience the world, and how their experiences translate into injustices and inequities. And the mobility justice framework helps us think about the fact that inequity in transportation isn't just about who has access to what. So do you have a bike lane? Do you have a transit stop near you? Are you overburdened by crashes, for example? But it also helps us think about other forms of injustices, like fairness or the denial of fairness in participation, exclusion from procedure decision-making, and it requires attention to historical harms, and it values the knowledge of people. And one thing that it does, and I'm taking this image from the Untokening Network, who has laid out these principles in a very clear manner. Identity is central among these principles of mobility justice, recognizing that who you are influences how you see the world and how the world sees you. And there are implications for planning, for engineering, for other sectors, and not recognizing that role that identity can play. Some of the work that I've done has tried to look at the importance of understanding identity and how identity plays a role in travel behavior and thinking about safety. And some of the earliest research that I did was I surveyed and interviewed Latino immigrants to understand sustainable transportation decision-making. So what motivated them to bicycle, what motivated them to take public transit, how, what were the barriers in those decisions. And one of the things that came out of that research was the critical importance of social networks and sort of familial networks in facilitating or preventing that travel, especially when it came to cycling. For those who were interested in cycling, a lot of that interest came from whether their friends did it or whether their groups that they belonged to did it. And if they didn't do it, it was because, again, people in their networks had sort of given them warnings about how unsafe it was to bicycle. And so, again, thinking about sort of who you are in relation to those, to the networks that you have, can bring insight into sort of understanding, your level of comfort with cycling. Another instance of identity, some work that others have done, and most notably Charles Brown out of Rutgers University, has highlighted some of the particular barriers to cycling and responses that Black cyclists take. And some of these barriers are the infrastructure, again, and the safety, but some of those are sort of outside of the realm of what we think of as traditional planning. In his study and other studies with Black participants, not feeling safe from crime was a common barrier to cycling, in addition to inadequate infrastructure. But so was racial profiling by the police for both Black and Latino cyclists. And there's documented instances of disproportionate policing against Black cyclists in Detroit, in Tampa, and Chicago, as I'll share a little bit later. And there's that sort of identity kind of at a neighborhood level, especially in thinking about cities with severe levels of spatial and residential segregation, also is borne out in the safety statistics as well. So in a few studies that have looked at relationships between socioeconomic status of the neighborhoods and traffic safety in general, they find the more disadvantaged the neighborhood is, the more likely they are to have bicycle crashes, whether you're looking by race, ethnicity, nativity status, income, so on. So there's, again, understanding sort of the context, understanding individuals and who they are is going to help sort of frame the issue around safety. So with all of that in mind, I want to shift and talk a little bit more about sort of the connections between safety and policing. And I'm going to focus mostly on cycling here, which is where the studies that I've done have taken us. And I think the first thing I want to point out is that I think there's a common conception of cyclists as scofflaws, as lawbreakers. Every cyclist is going to break the law. And that, for the most part, is true, but it's also true that everyone, no matter the mode, has broken a traffic rule. If a large-scale global study of about 18,000 respondents showed that over 95% of drivers, pedestrians, cyclists have broken a traffic rule of some sort. So maybe not coming to a complete stop at a stop sign, for example, or not yielding the right of way. So cyclists aren't only at fault here. But the thing to keep in mind is that these studies have also shown that the reason, or much of the reason why cyclists perform these illegal behaviors is because it makes them feel safer. They'll tend to break rules when it's the safest and quickest option. In a study with Montreal cyclists, given a few hypothetical scenarios, cyclists chose to break a traffic rule most often when they felt it was safer than precisely following the vehicle code. So this comes into play, especially in the context that I am looking at in my study in Chicago, because in some cities, it is illegal to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk. And in those cities, most citations to cyclists are given for riding on the sidewalk. In the city of Chicago, that's 90% of citations were issued for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. Cyclists generally prefer off-street separated infrastructure. The more separation from traffic, the more it's preferred. And cyclists, especially if they're timid or less experienced cyclists, will ride on the sidewalk along high traffic roads when there's no other infrastructure. So these deficiencies in planning and infrastructure can drive behavior that will then get you in trouble, some would argue for no fault of your own. So the question then is policing the right safety intervention? And we'll stick with riding on the sidewalk for a moment here, because that's where most bicycle citations are issued. And there's some evidence that shows that riding a bike on the sidewalk is between 2 to 16 times more dangerous than riding on the road, depending on the type of infrastructure on the road that's available. And that's both for dangers with other pedestrians, but also dangers in sort of crossings, driveways across bike paths like the one that you see in the image, but also at intersections. Higher rate of collisions, falls, and injuries on sidewalks compared to other infrastructure, but not. It depends on what's available, whether it's most dangerous. So it's more dangerous than riding against traffic, but as dangerous as riding on mixed use paths with pedestrians. But the other problem with policing is in the disparities in sort of who is being issued these tickets. Traffic stops are the most common form of interaction with the police in public. And there's not a lot of work that's looking at cycling specifically in terms of police enforcement. But when we look at traffic policing from many studies using a large number of citations, large data sets, 20 million, 100 million traffic stops, all of these studies find disparities in who is stopped, in who is searched, and who is cited. And across departments of all sizes. And many times that's because traffic stops are used as a strategy of targeting policing in communities of color and are not tied to the most dangerous safety problems. When we're looking at cycling in Chicago, for example, they've issued a disproportionate number of bicycle tickets in the majority Black and Latino neighborhoods. And at the time that these statistics came out, published by the Chicago Tribune, the police department came out and said, yes, this is part of our strategy to our crime reduction strategy and is not necessarily tied to safety. These other studies of traffic stops have found that when traffic enforcement focuses specifically on safety incidents or the most dangerous incidents, which would be with cars, there was actually little evidence of racial disparities in the traffic enforcement, but it was for those discretionary stops like pulling someone over because the light's out or a bicycle ticket for riding on the sidewalk, which may not be the most dangerous activity. That's when we started to see the racial disparities. And I think it's also important to remember what the dangers are of enforcement when we're thinking about cycling. And in Los Angeles over the summer, there was a high-profile shooting where sheriff's deputies killed a Black man for code violations on his bicycle, which was biking on the wrong side of the road and for splitting traffic and sort of, in the wake of other protests this summer, really calls into question what role the police should have in terms of traffic enforcement, and especially for behaviors that may not be the most dangerous behaviors. The LA Times did an analysis, went back 15 years and found 16 other similar cases in history where Black cyclists were killed at the hands of the police. So with all of this in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of studies that I've done that look at issues of safety and injustice. And the first one is looking at differences in whether features of the built environment, like transportation infrastructure, like the deficiencies that I was talking about earlier, like land use, are implicated in higher rates of bicycle crash occurrences, or are there other factors involved with this? So what I did was took the SWITRS data set, the statewide integrated traffic record system in California, which is a database of all police reported crashes. And there are issues with using police reported crashes in that not all crashes are captured, and the identities of the individuals involved in the crashes are reported by the police. There's not consistent reporting mechanisms, but it is the most comprehensive and sort of the best data source for crash occurrences in California. So he took a data set of about 7,100 bicycle crashes, 7,088 bicycle crashes over a 3-year period in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I wanted to look at the connection between infrastructure, between those neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics, between land use and potential causes for differences in bicycle crash occurrences among racial and ethnic groups. So what I did first was look at differences of infrastructure across neighborhood composition. And so the way to read this image is on the left is showing the type of infrastructure, whether or not a census tract had that kind of infrastructure. And then across the columns there, I'm looking at the share of that characteristic in the census tract. So what's the relationship between the presence of that infrastructure and the share of that group? And we can see that in the Bay Area, at the time I did this study, the findings mirror what I've already talked about, that in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, higher poverty neighborhoods, there was less bicycle infrastructure and more sort of unsafe infrastructure for cyclists. And the opposite was true for census tracts. The opposite was true for the white population in those tracts. And this is not looking at just at mileage at all. This is just looking at the presence of the type of infrastructure. So less infrastructure in disadvantaged neighborhoods, more dangerous infrastructure for cyclists in terms of high traffic or high speed streets in neighborhoods of color. So then I looked at the incidence and the number of crashes across neighborhoods in the Bay Area in these 5 counties here, accounting for this infrastructure, and found in general that, again, Black cyclists face a disproportionate risk of crashes, but that lower traffic volumes and bike infrastructure did not reduce the crash incidence for Black or Latino groups when controlling for these factors. So heavier traffic, as proxied by arterial roadways, predicted more crashes per distance cycled, but for Black and Latino cyclists, those effects were particularly pronounced and not mitigated by lower traffic roads. So what it suggests to me is that even if there is infrastructure available, there was less, but when it was available, there was some sort of qualitatively negative difference in that type of infrastructure in majority person of color neighborhoods and the majority white neighborhoods that led to these disparities in crashes. So what I wanted to do next is kind of bring in traffic enforcement into the equation and think about this link between safety, between infrastructure, and between traffic enforcement. And again, I'm using cycling as a case study. And I'm bringing back the idea of vision zero that I talked about earlier in the talk, and talking about the shift of the safety paradigm. In Chicago, this is work that I've done with a community-based organization, Equiticity, that's focused on mobility justice in the city of Chicago. And we have kind of a series of studies that are looking at different outcomes and different policies, and with an eye towards improving outcomes for people of color in the city in terms of transportation outcomes, in terms of economic outcomes, looking at barriers to employment, looking at sort of how performance-based planning incorporates equity principles. And this study is looking at the role of police enforcement on cycling. So it came about because Equiticity was concerned that the Vision Zero plan in Chicago, which was released in 2017, included as a central component of their plan police engagement. And for the Equiticity as a Black-led organization, this was obviously problematic to them. And they were interested in sort of understanding what the impact of this could be. It's that police engagement, again, is very centrally part of the language of the plan. And while it talks about focusing on the most dangerous behaviors, the statistics bear out that a significant number of cyclists are also being cited by the police. So what we did is looked at the number of tickets issued per street segment from a Freedom of Information Act request from the Chicago Police Department. We got the locations and the types of all of the citations issued for bicycle-related offenses between 2014 and 2019, although I'm just looking at those later 3 years here. And again, what they showed, 90% of those tickets are issued for riding on the sidewalk. So there's some connection to the availability of infrastructure, given what I talked about before in terms of how cyclists respond to what they perceive as unsafe conditions. So we were able to get that list of tickets. A thing to note is that the tickets didn't include information about the identity of the individuals, only where and when the citation was issued. And so we looked at characteristics, how the influence of characteristics of the neighborhood, so neighborhood sociodemographic, characteristics of the street, whether there was bicycle infrastructure available, what the functional class of the street was, and what the level of cycling volume was using the Strava Metro data set. There are challenges in using big data for tracking cycling volumes in terms of the representation, but they give a sense, at least, of the overall cycling flow in the city. And then we also looked at police presence in the neighborhood and safety, whether safety was driving the incidence of tickets issued. So again, 90% of these tickets were issued for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, and they go from a high in 2014 to almost 4,000 tickets issued in the city for riding on the sidewalk to the low of 1,343 in 2019. And you start to see a big decline in the year starting in 2017. And the reason for this is because the ACLU came to an agreement with the Chicago Police Department in which the department would collect and report more data on their stop and frisk practices. So in a lot of the pedestrian citations were presumed to be part of this stop and frisk program, and it's likely that a lot of these bicycle citations were too. That agreement became effective in 2017, and we can see, although I didn't test for the causality of this, we can see a correlation with a decline in the number of tickets issued. So that's another reason why I'm just looking at the citations from 2017 on. If you're not familiar with the city of Chicago, it's a city of 2.7 million people, and it's roughly divided 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between Black residents, white residents, and Latino residents, although that Black population is declining as there's been an exodus from the city to the suburbs. The city is starkly segregated. The metro area, depending on how you count, is ranked 5th on indices of segregation. And this image here is showing you the racial and ethnic distribution in the city, and I'm highlighting areas here, circling two areas, which are predominantly Black neighborhoods on the west and south sides of the city. Because I'm also now going to show you statistics around the number of citations issued and crashes and infrastructure. So again, those same circles, I'm showing you here on the left the number of citations issued per 1,000 residents, the bicycle citations issued. There's an average of 5.9 tickets per 1,000 issued in majority Black census tracts, 1.9 per thousand in majority Latino tracts, and 0.7 in majority white tracts. So those, I mean, the circles are kind of highlighting that stark visual of those disparities in the number of tickets that are issued. Those disparities hold when controlling for all those other characteristics that I talked about earlier, for infrastructure, for cycling volume, for neighborhood context. If you are in a census tract, or the higher the share the Black population or Latino population in a census tract, for every 1% increase in the share of those populations, there's about a 2% higher chance of getting a ticket on a street segment compared to white neighborhoods. If we shift to the middle map here, this is a map of the bike injury crashes in Chicago, and the darker colors indicate more crashes that were fatal, serious, or severe. And again, those two circles in the west and south side neighborhoods, far fewer crashes than if you look in the corridor here, which leads to downtown, known locally as the Hipster Highway, where there's a high amount of bicycle traffic there, and more crashes on the north side, which are the whiter neighborhoods in the city. Pair that with the image on the right, again, circling those west and south side majority Black neighborhoods, less infrastructure in those neighborhoods too. So to put some numbers to it, where Black people make up either the majority or plurality of the population in a tract, about 12% of the street lengths are arterial streets compared to 9% in majority white neighborhoods. 6 to 9% of the street lengths in Black neighborhoods have any bike infrastructure compared to 12% for white neighborhoods. So again, more tickets, fewer crashes, less infrastructure in majority Black neighborhoods. So we can take a look at the role that the infrastructure plays in terms of the number of citations issued along a street segment. And this image is showing in reference to streets without bicycle facilities and in reference to local streets, how many tickets were issued or what were the odds of getting a ticket on a street segment compared to those reference categories. And you can see as you go up in the street classification, the more likely you are to get a ticket. And that could be because there may be more cycling volume on the street, but also you may be more likely to ride on the sidewalk on those streets. But in almost every instance, for those higher traffic streets, the collector and the arterial streets, when there was a bicycle facility on the street, the odds of getting a ticket decreased. So in general, when the major street types had bike infrastructure, the incident rate of tickets was cut by about 30%. When we look at some of the other characteristics around policing and safety, we actually don't find an effect. I didn't find an effect on the number of citations issued. So those top two lines here are the critical ones to pay attention to. Serious bike crashes, there was no difference. There was no relationship between the number of serious bike crashes and the number of tickets issued along those street segments. And in fact, when I looked at crashes of all modes, there were the more serious crashes there were of all modes, the fewer the fewer bicycling tickets there were issued. So it shows that these enforcement actions are not tied to safety incidents, and there's a link here between that absence of infrastructure on all streets, and particularly in neighborhoods of color, and the outcomes in terms of policing. So again, I think these two studies, but particularly the second study, points to these clear associations between infrastructure disadvantage and policing, and kind of showing how planning and infrastructure is intertwined with those unjust policing practices. Greater incidence of tickets in Black neighborhoods, that bike infrastructure lowered the ticket incidence, and safety was not linked to enforcement, again, as the Chicago Police Department themselves reported. But these planning and investment failures compound other inequities. So there's that racial bias in the distribution of cycling tickets on its own, but those tickets were issued because cyclists were riding on the sidewalk in the first place, and is likely an adaptation in response to this inequitable infrastructure. And this has come up in other work I've been involved with in focus group research, where we did focus groups with residents of Chicago South Side neighborhoods to understand sort of what their barriers to transportation were, and this issue of getting citations when there was no safe alternative to the sidewalk came up in those conversations. So for me, what that does is really sort of call attention to transportation planners who are working in these spaces to think about what this relationship between planning, policing, and race is. And I think, again, sort of calling back to these ideas of mobility justice, where we put identity at the center of how we think about transportation equity and inequity, can really sort of help us think through this. The conclusion that planning via policing, or the assertion of police powers, has been racist in intent or outcome is not new, from single family zoning to the development of freeways, but I think sort of these strategies that link together safe systems, that link together enforcement, kind of explicitly bring the planning and policing together in ways that may not have been done, have been true in the past. And so, calls for removing the role of enforcement in traffic safety are warranted. Berkeley, California has called for this and is studying this now to understand how it might be implemented in practice. It shows the importance of infrastructure, of bicycle infrastructure. But we know from other work that just sort of putting bike lanes in everywhere is not the way to do it. And especially in communities of color that are gentrifying, that have been calling for infrastructure for a long time, but haven't seen it. There's some skepticism about why it's going in at the time that it does, and so it calls for sort of engaging with the community at the level that they're at to make sure that what is being planned and built is what the community actually needs. And again, as I've already said, sort of these intersections of identity and mobility are important to recognize, and that needs differ across different groups. Safety for one is not safety for all. And when we sort of fail to account for the differences, I think the studies here that I've done show what the potential unintended consequences of this can be. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion for the rest of our time together.
Thanks so much, Jesus. That was powerful. And this would be the time when there'd be an audience applauding. And I have to imagine it's happening in the ether. We're just getting used to the silence in there. But seeing the comments coming up, there've been quite a bit. I want to just start and maybe ask a couple of questions, and then it looks like I can see some piling up here that we can turn things over to Jacob. I mean, the data you presented about racial bias and bicycle safety and enforcement is really powerful. You started out by also showing us this huge increase in pedestrian, both a broad problem in pedestrian accident crashes and fatalities, but also racial bias in that as well. Can I ask you can you say a few words about where there are similarities and differences as you understand it with what you've been finding with cycling, with respect to infrastructure, with respect to enforcement, in terms of racial disparities in pedestrian safety as well, because that's obviously a huge part of this problem as well.
Yeah, I think so. The patterns, as I understand them, are similar. The infrastructure is a little bit harder to get at, and I'm actually working on a project right now to figure this out, and sort of the role that infrastructure plays, because cities, I think, are good at sharing their shapefiles of bike networks, but are not so good at accounting for sidewalk infrastructure. And I think there's lots of cities that are out of compliance with ADA and have ADA transition plans precisely because they don't know the conditions of their sidewalks. But there's, from some of the work in Chicago that I've done there, it looks like there might be a relationship between lack of sidewalks or poor sidewalks and some of the safety and enforcement actions, although I'm not ready to sort of do another 50-minute presentation on that at the moment. So that's where I'm at with that.
And one more follow up to something that you said at the beginning that really struck me was that about the disparities between injuries and fatalities for people in motor vehicles relative to those outside them.
Yeah.
Is there an inverse relationship? As vehicles, you talked about the size, but they become safer for occupants. That there's anti-lock brakes, there's airbags, there's a variety of things that have been filtering through, making the vehicle occupants safer and safer. And then, so the risk of traveling quickly for the driver goes down over time. Do you see some relationship between actually making cars safer for the occupants, maybe making them less safe for those who have to be around them?
Yeah, I mean, anecdotal evidence for sure. I don't know that I've seen the empirical work that shows this, but the book Right of Way, I think, lays this out pretty well. That talks about how, as vehicles have gotten safer, at the same time it's gotten worse for pedestrians. And I think the kind of two takeaways from that book for me were the size of the vehicles. If your chances of survival at 20 miles an hour are much better as a pedestrian than at 40 miles an hour, where it's almost certainly fatal. But the size of the vehicle at that speed also matters when we're talking about sort of a small Honda Civic versus a large Ford F-350 or whatever. That the size of vehicles has gotten has increased on average over time, and the result of impacts has gotten worse. The other thing is that now we have all these screens in our cars, not to mention the screens that we carry with us all the time, and so that distraction level is also playing a role.
I want to let the audience jump in. Jacob, do you have some questions queued up you'd like to pose to Jesus?
Yeah, and thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it, and sort of putting it in the context of the whole lecture series as well. Our first question is from Mari, who I just promoted to panelist. See if I can.
So I am a Master's of Urban Planning student, and I'm working on developing the research question for my Master's Planning report. And I really want to make sure that I am integrating issues of mobility justice into the research that I eventually end up doing over the course of the next year for this project. I'm interested in what recommendations that you would have for ways of doing that, in especially around community engagement now with the added challenges of COVID restrictions.
Yeah. So I have not had personal experience in having to sort of engage with communities during this time. I think the work that I was involved with took place before this came about. So I'm still struggling with thinking about the right way to engage these communities as well. And in a different project that was focused on pedestrian access to transit, that was not necessarily focused on communities of color, but was with kind of generally low income populations. It was difficult in getting in touch with folks because, as I know, it was internet access was spotty. Getting time to contact folks was difficult. Phone calls were sometimes difficult to have. But there are the resource that I would point you to that talks about kind of the general principles about researchers engaging with communities is from the Greenlining Institute, and they have a report, Making Research Real, or I forget the title. And that's, I think that's a gold standard in terms of how to think about mobility justice with relationship to community engagement, respecting people, paying people if you can, paying for their time and expertise, not just the participants, but if you're working with organizations to help you connect with participants, making sure that they get paid too, and to the extent that you can, co-developing research projects with them. So this study, the second study that I talked about today, that was that research. The question in the research, the research question came about because Equiticity put out a call that said, we really want to investigate this issue and we need research expertise to help us do this. Who's in? And so we worked together to design what the question was, and then I brought the research expertise into it. So I think, Greenlining Institute, paying people and co-creating the research project together, I think will go a long way into sort of incorporating those voices centrally into the project.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Our next question is from Amanda, and I know you touched on this at the end, but really getting into it, what recommendations do you have for planners, for engineers, for anybody in this space to reduce disparities in infrastructure and enforcement and achieve more equitable outcomes? Sort of for those practitioners in the audience, what recommendations do you have?
Yeah, I would just sort of reiterate what I've already said. I think the data-driven nature of Vision Zero, I think, has really shined a light on where those infrastructure deficiencies are, and so applying that to the city, making sure that you know where your deficiencies are. The one thing that's missing too is the quality of the infrastructure. So you may know where the bike lane is, and you may know where the separated bikeway is, but if the road condition is poor, if there are still dangerous intersections to navigate, that doesn't always show up in that data audit. So I think that's an important missing layer that needs to be in there. Planners using their positions to advocate for the removal of traffic enforcement from armed police, I think, is an important is important and based in the evidence. It's an important claim to stake and is based in the evidence. I think from what I've shown, but also from what others have shown, that when enforcement is focused entirely on safety and sort of the discretionary aspect is taken out, you get a lot more equitable outcomes in terms of enforcement. And so that's not something that planners and engineers can do by themselves, but it's something that they can sort of begin conversations and advocate for across departments in the city. That's what I would do if I were a practitioner.
Great. And along those lines, next question is from Jorge. If you want to turn on your camera, great.
Hi, Jesus. Thanks for your presentation. It was amazing. My question is how to implement pedestrian and cyclist infrastructure where small groups of noisy car-oriented stakeholders hijack the conversation and jeopardize council members. That's a huge problem in LA. We have a lot of backlashes of all these neighbors that they don't want bike lanes, they don't want safe crosswalks. And it's really frustrating because we know what to do. We know that infrastructure will save lives, but these communities value more speed than protecting human lives. So how we can overcome this problem?
I wish I had a great answer for you, but I don't. I think it takes coalition building from the community members who are sort of who understand the data, who can advocate for the need. I think a lot of these issues are rooted in issues of inequity. If you're prioritizing speed, you're deprioritizing pedestrians and cyclists. People of color are more likely to be pedestrian and cyclists than drivers, even though most of them drive. So, that the coalition building, I come back to that in terms of sort of getting together to counter those powerful voices. The problem is that the powerful voices often have a lot of money, and so that's hard to counteract. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer to say. But I used to live in LA in 2008 to 2011, and I remember the same issue, that there was a new bike plan that was proposed in 08 or 09, I think. And I remember it was notable for actually removing the total mileage of bicycle infrastructure from the plan over the previous one because of these loud voices. And what kind of saved it, I think, were a group of folks, many of whom were equity minded and people of color, to kind of to tell the city, hold on, we need to do this right and prioritize equity among the things that we do. So yeah, again, I don't, it's not there's no easy answer, I don't think. I'm not a position that I know how to navigate from experience.
Thank you, Jesus.
All right. Our next question is on the data you use and disparities you find in that. So Karen asks about if you have data on the percentage of cyclists that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color compared to the percentage of citations for cyclists that are issued to Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
I don't, unfortunately. So there are two limitations to the data that maybe I didn't make clear, but I'll make clear now. One is that the citations I have are only identify the location. They don't identify characteristics of the people. So I actually don't know if someone who was cited was Black, Indigenous, Latino, white, whatever. I only know where it was. Now, having said that, Chicago is a little different than many other cities in that it is, well, many cities are segregated, but Chicago is very highly segregated. So the likelihood that someone being ticketed in a community of color, being a person of color, is very high. So I can only say stuff about the location. On the cycling volume, so I only talked about the Strava Metro data that I have. And again, that doesn't identify racial or ethnic characteristics of the people. But we did have, we had some household travel survey data for the city of Chicago that broke down the race and ethnicity a bit. And we, I'm forgetting the other data source that I drew on. Oh, census data, just to get a sense of what the relative share of cyclists was. But we weren't able to kind of link the racial identity of the person getting cited with the racial identity of a cyclist because we don't have those data.
All right, and next I'm bringing on Bryn, who had a comment about the relationship of your research to work that she's doing.
This is a great presentation. Yeah, I just want to let you know how important and sort of salient it is. Work for an org in LA called Climate Resolve, and kind of trying to fight this trope that that bike lanes equals gentrification and is bad for people of color, right? And so any more data we can get, kind of uncovering, yeah, the crashes that are out there and the racial demographics of people who are biking. I think it helps the cause to try to make it safer out there. So, you know, appreciate, you know, I think we can reach conclusions that like separate bike infrastructure reduces crashes, right? And I think also a tool to reduce like racist enforcement policies, right? If you're getting people kind of in a space where they belong and feel safe, right, in a separate bike lane. Since you're keen on looking at like identity impacts, thought I just wanted to also mention that as a woman cyclist, yeah, having separate bike infrastructure really reduces the amount of harassment I receive. And I know there's quite big like gender disparities out there too, right? And the people that feel comfortable safe cycling. So I just wanted to raise that. But I was wondering if you could, you know, you mentioned displacement a little at the end, and so I thought I'd see if you could, or gentrification of like the timing of the investments you mentioned a little towards the end of your presentation. So I'm wondering, you know, if you could say sort of if these benefits of sort of reducing crashes and reducing racist enforcement, reducing harassment, if you think that sort of outweighs, yeah, I guess I'm wondering if there's enough sort of evidence and data on like gentrification impacts from bike lane investments that you would say one way or another, like which is more helpful or hurtful to communities of color, or investing in safe infrastructure or not.
Well, so I'm of the position that like safety is paramount, and there is, I mean, it's very context specific in terms of the relationship between gentrification and bike infrastructure. I think we find it in places that are rapidly gentrifying, and in places that are not, we find less of it. I think it's especially acute in places with sort of green, sort of the green gentrification issue, where recreational facilities are installed in cities, and we find higher levels of gentrification there. So in Chicago, where I did this study, the 606 trail is similar to the High Line in New York. It's an old unused elevated rail trail that was converted into a multi-use path going through some more well-to-do neighborhoods and going through some communities of color, and along that line, we've seen more gentrification there. So but it doesn't mean that that needs to be what happens, right? There are other policies that can go along with the infrastructure development, like, you know, anti-displacement policies, affordable housing, you know, rent stabilization, those sorts of things that can and should go together. In California, it's difficult, right? Housing is really difficult here, and it's anyway, it's hard to do, but I think those other things need to go together. So it's not an either or, but I think it's a both and, that all of this needs to happen if we're thinking about safety, if we're thinking about equity, if we're thinking about anti-gentrification and anti-displacement.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Jesus, I'd like to jump in with another question along these lines, and that was the data you showed on the racial disparities in Chicago were incredibly powerful and stark. Not only the sort of the descriptive analysis of the huge differences across, you know, enforcement, safety, and sort of infrastructure, but also the statistical model showing just a lack of relationship between enforcement and those outcomes. What kind of a reception has that had among sort of the police or transportation officials in Chicago, as opposed to others? I mean, how have they reacted to that? I mean, have you been able to move the needle in terms of presenting data that is so compelling to decision makers in this regard?
Yeah, to the police, no. I mean, that's a whole, there's a, I mean, the relationship between city leadership and police and the public in Chicago is, you could, you know, write books on this, and I'm sure books have been written on this. And I think the policing powers were used together with stopping transit over the summer to, you know, stop to isolate protesters in downtown areas, and that it's been like the folks who care about transportation equity are not happy with kind of the top level leadership and their relationship with the police department on that regard. With the Department of Transportation, though, I think this work, along with some other work and my colleagues in kind of this broader mobility justice in Chicago discussion, is having an effect. One of my colleagues is working on issues of automated enforcement and finding disparities in the outcomes of you know, traffic cameras for people of color, and that has gotten the attention of the commissioner in the Department of Transportation in terms of sort of thinking through racial equity in the broader transportation world. They have been, the Department of Transportation has seen this work and is sort of has been mulling over for some time, removing the sort of explicit language of enforcement from their Vision Zero action plan, which I think is a positive step. That movement has kind of stalled in sort of the other priorities that have happened in the COVID times. But, you know, there's some hopefulness in some circles, and kind of the continued despair in others. So it's just kind of dependent on the organization and the group.
So, and one other follow-up on the issue about the allocation of bike infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, for that matter, is that there is this systematic effect of well-heeled, affluent, mostly white neighborhoods able to advocate effectively for you know, a disproportionate share of resources across so many dimensions. Do you see the answer is sort of like better organizing, empowering other groups in sort of a political battle over resources, or should planners, engineers take sort of a more systematic and data-driven approach that says, you know, here's where the safety problems are, this is where the resources are going, regardless of this, you know, the neighborhoods vying for that? Because it does seem that whenever you're in this battle over resources, those well-heeled, mostly white neighborhoods always end up with the goods, and this just gets played out over and over again. So is the answer to sort of try to empower this in a political battle over resources, or do engineers or planners have some argument for saying, hey, we're going to use the data that are very clear about these disparities and try and shift resources in that way? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, the example I come to for that is actually with respect to street paving in Oakland. I think that's a really good example of planners using data to move the needle of the conversation. And what happened there was with one of the sales tax measures, the city was able to accelerate their street repaving program from something like the 50-year timeline to something closer to 5 to 10 years. I forget the exact number. But the way that they made decisions about where to repave was not just on the basis of pavement quality, but also on overlays with indicators of community disadvantage. And so that those equity indicators got ranked highly in the scoring mechanism. And so the story was people in the hills were upset that their streets weren't getting repaved, but when for those who weren't like sort of not who were willing to see the data, when they saw sort of the condition of pavement in the flat neighborhoods and the level of disinvestment in those neighborhoods, I mean, I think some people were won over. But those equity driven processes where sort of the equity metrics come to the front, I think are sort of important ways to be able to use the data to implement more equitable systems. But so having said all that, I think there is place and a need for some political discussion about this, right? Where we have a representative democracy, maybe people deserve to have their voices heard, and there are always problems with data. That we like to think that the numbers are right, but as folks in sort of racial data studies have shown, the data are generated by political processes too, right? So I think there's a great case to be made for letting sort of equity metrics drive the conversation, but I don't think it can be to the exclusion of sort of that political battle.
I'm going to turn things back over to Jacob, but just if you're interested, we at UCLA ITS publish Transfers magazine on behalf of the Pacific Southwest University Transportation Center, and a recent issue has an article on the Oakland. I wasn't fishing for that example, but we do have that, and maybe we'll get someone to drop a link in the chat for those interested in seeing that. Jacob, back to you.
Great. Another question on sort of the data relationship to crashes. Robin asks about if bike crashes are related to total car trip traffic. What is the relationship you're seeing between congestion on a street, and maybe it differs by type of street, and bike crashes?
Yeah, I do not have data on traffic volume. That's not comprehensive in the city of Chicago. I only had data on street type. And I think there was a generally positive relationship with the number of crashes and the street type, but I don't remember the strength of that relationship. So it's by street classification. Local, arterial, collector, and so
on. And relatedly, Manuel asks about as congestion becomes more prevalent and land use sort of spreads out, cyclists, and I might add probably particularly low-income cyclists, are traveling far beyond their neighborhood boundaries. So how should planners account for that? Maybe cyclists don't live near where improvements are proposed, or they don't work near there, they just traverse it. How should planners think about that, plan for that, do engagement considering that fact?
Well, I mean, I think so. I'm trying to think of how I would answer this question. I think there are there are other elements that we can use to hopefully reduce that distance that cyclists have to travel, whether through more affordable housing options and denser development in locations. I think the two sides to access are kind of the distance that you have to travel and the amount of stuff that's nearby. And I think here the greater measure or the greater impact, although slower, would be to kind of fix that what stuff is nearby through development patterns. So, I think it's, I think, more cycling infrastructure should be in as many places as possible, and so that will certainly help there. But there are other avenues also to kind of help with that problem.
Great. We have a question on training and education too. Gary asks about the relationship between bicycle training and sort of safety in various communities and neighborhoods, recognizing that it's probably difficult to get the data on that. But what efficacy do you see for training programs?
If the question's asking about helping helping teach cyclists how to bicycle, I think there's evidence that shows that it helps build confidence. I think what I found in my own work is not necessarily formal training programs, but with communities that do cycling events or where streets are closed and little kids can ride in the streets and like slow street events or something like ciclovia. That sort of learning to cycle and cycling with other people helps build the confidence of cyclists, and I think the more confident of a cyclist you are, the better outcomes you'll have in terms of safety. I don't have sort of the hard empirical numbers on the efficacy of training programs, but my sense is from my reading of the literature and the work that I've done that they would be beneficial.
Great. And sort of a big question from Professor Mike Manville here at UCLA right at the end here, is asking in follow-up to the earlier discussion that Bryn brought up about the relationship between gentrification and bike lanes. He asked, is there any actual evidence that bike lanes cause gentrification? Very tricky question there, I know.
Not to my knowledge. I know there's cross-sectional work that shows, again, sort of the context, depending on the city context, that there's a relationship between bike lanes and changes in neighborhood composition. But there is, to my knowledge, no work that shows a causal relationship. Doesn't mean there isn't one, just means that no one's looked for it. And I think the data would be very difficult to find to get that information.
Okay, we're going to wrap up. Jesus, thank you so much for the powerful talk and being so patient answering questions. There's a few other questions in the chat. I think we can probably forward that if that's necessary or possible, and if for additional questions. I did want to let those on the line know that we're still in the midst of this series on transportation and race and transportation. We have 2 more lectures coming up on March 4th. We have Sarah Seo, who is going to deliver the Wax Distinguished Lecture on Policing the Open Road, building on her book on that topic. And on March 11th, we have Walter Thompson Hernandez talking about the Compton Cowboys and California Love. So thanks so much for attending. Thank you, Jesus of UC Davis for his presentation. And thank you all for participating in this series. Take care.
Thanks.